On an unbearably humid morning in August 1855, a child stood on an auction block in Savannah, and no one wanted him. Not for lack of flesh or bone, he was gaunt enough to show his ribs, but for the way light slid off him and seemed not to belong. Skin so pale it read almost translucent beneath the sun, hair the color of unspun silk, eyes like pale embers that did not meet a face so much as pass through it. The crowd tightened around superstition like a second skin. Whispers called him cursed. Hands stayed in pockets. Bidders moved on. The auctioneer lowered the price, $20, $15, $10, until the block registered the humiliating sum of $5. Then a woman in a carriage raised a fan with the slow, deliberate grace of someone accustomed to command. Margaret Denore, a widow who oversaw 4,000 acres 12 miles out from the city, paid $12 and framed it as Christian charity. The crowd applauded the spectacle of generosity. They did not know, could not have known, that Margaret had spent 3 years looking for a child like this, someone who met a catalog of peculiarities she had read about and cataloged obsessively. They could not have imagined that 73 people would vanish from her holdings over the next 14 years, their names supposed to be recorded in ledgers that, according to local rumor, were burned in 1861. One ledger survived, hidden and later found in a foundation wall, but that discovery belonged to another century. For now, on that sweltering day, the only thing certain was the boy's purchase and the calm, clinical attention with which Margaret regarded him. Margaret was a force of presence. At 47, a widow for 13 years, she carried weight as easily as money. Her bulk declared property and power in a world that read both as authority. What unsettled people more than any visible measure was her library. Hundreds of volumes on natural philosophy, anatomy, animal husbandry, hereditary theory, books that, collected over a decade, turned curiosity into obsession. Those were the books she brought to bear the moment the boy was lifted into her carriage. They called him Thomas then, a name given by earlier owners. He survived the ride to Belmont in the corner of the carriage, pressed like a specimen into leather. Margaret said little to him. Instead, she opened a bound journal and began to write as if the child were an entry in a study. Approximate age, hue of skin under differing light, shade of eyes at noon versus dusk, the size of his hands and feet measured with the gaze of a naturalist. Her driver, Augustus, a man who had served the family for decades, watched with a jaw clenched against questions he did not voice. He had learned early to keep silence. Belmont's compound lay hidden nearly a mile from the main house, reached by a lane threaded through pines. The buildings had been built over years from materials bought in small amounts, by hands that were then dispersed. Workers sold away so they could not tell the whole. When the carriage stopped before the largest structure, Margaret led Thomas inside. The interior was designed to feel modern and clean. Whitewashed walls, pine floors, glass windows, comfort with a clinical edge. "This will be your room," she told him, her voice cultured and flat. A bed, a chair, a table with a basin, a shelf. Promises followed, mapped out like rules. Adequate food, clothing, shelter, so long as he cooperated with procedures, measurements, medical examinations, observations. Questions about lessons were permitted, questions about anything else were not. He would be taught to read, to write, to understand natural philosophy. He would not speak to others without permission. He would not leave. If he disobeyed, punishment would be severe. Thomas understood obedience. He had learned quickly that survival in that place required stillness. Margaret locked the door from outside and left him to the small, echoing room. He sat on the bed's edge with his back against the wall and waited. The house itself might as well have been a laboratory. Its quiet carried the hum of intentions that were not spoken aloud, but felt in the way doors shut and lists were kept. Below, in a cool basement lit by oil lamps, Margaret dipped a pen and began an entry that would read later like a manifesto in miniature. August 17th, 1855. Subject 0 has arrived at Belmont. Initial observations suggest excellent quality for the purification project. Pure albinism evident in all physical characteristics. Begin preliminary measurements tomorrow, followed by educational assessment. Subject 0 represents the foundation upon which all subsequent phases will build. If theories prove correct, this acquisition validates 13 years of preparation. She recorded him as specimen and fulcrum. She marked him as the instrument through which speculation about heredity might be proven. To her, Thomas was less a boy than the key to a hypothesis that had years of quiet labor behind it. Over the next months, she set a tempo for his life. Measurements at dawn, weekly weighings on a scale brought from Philadelphia, monthly examinations that lasted hours, each a data point, each entered with neat, uncompromising script. Education was part of the regimen. A tutor, Christopher Vance, arrived twice weekly to teach reading, writing, arithmetic, the sort of instruction presented as benevolence, and received that way by an eager teacher who believed he was participating in progressive studies. Margaret chose texts designed to shape the mind she had bought. Anatomical plates, agricultural manuals on breeding, treatises on variation and heredity. Thomas absorbed them with the frightening efficiency of a child who knows survival is tied to comprehension. Between lessons, Margaret's own instruction took another shape. She sat across from him with charts pinned to the walls, describing trait transmission among horses, showing bloodlines like knitting patterns to be unraveled. Then she turned the same language to people, races as developmental stages, traits as inheritable commodities to be concentrated by careful pairing. Her tone was steady, unshaken by moral friction. She never raised her hand. She did not need to. Isolation, the erasure of human connection, served as punishment as surely as a lash. Thomas's world contracted and expanded in equal measure. He had access to books, to measurements, to a life of precise routines, advantages that read like kindness until one remembered the purpose, to prepare him for a role he had not chosen. Such preparation was not abstract. Margaret's notes and charts detailed others kept in the compound, roughly 25 people at any time, acquired for particular traits and kept apart from the world. The records tracked births, the mournful tally of infant losses, the disappearances that were explained as failures of constitution. The truth, however, whispered in other ways. Muffled cries at night, the sudden vanishings of people carried away and not returned, a small cemetery hidden in the pines marked by temporary stakes. For Thomas, the years that followed unspooled like a methodical, living experiment. He learned to read the diagrams and the intentions behind them. He learned that his body was an index, a measure of what could be pulled from breeding and observation. He learned to be quiet. And somewhere in the slow, inevitable motion of Margaret's program, the idea of use, of being shaped into an instrument of reproduction, moved from the abstract into the neighborhood of imminence. Pembroke's confession should have been the end of her freedom. Instead, the law moved slowly, the machinery of deference grinding out familiar conclusions. Margaret retained lawyers who dressed cruelty in the language of property rights. Enslaved bodies, her counsel argued, were assets, their reproduction a master's prerogative. In a courtroom built to preserve a social order, technical legality often outweighed moral outrage. For months the question hung: would reputation and statute be stronger than evidence of deliberate brutality? What finally broke the stall of legal comfort was the forest. On a raw March morning in 1860, Sheriff Pritchard and his deputies walked the thin lanes behind Belmont, with Robert Chen and Augustus at their side. The pines closed over them like a curtain. Where Augustus had once been too fearful to go beyond a certain edge, he now moved with a tremulous steadiness, pointing to depressions in the loam and to where old wooden stakes had once stood. The markers had long since rotted away. Roots had braided through shallow graves, and the earth had smoothed its lies. But a careful eye found the truth, an array of disturbances, faint as old wounds, that hinted at far more than a handful of unrecorded burials. Digging confirmed the worst. Where the soil gave, small bones and cloth remnants answered the shovel. Infant remains lay curled and fragile. Some showed nothing but the inevitability of premature death. Others, older skeletons, bore the marks of violence, healed fractures that did not heal properly, skulls with blunt force deformities, joints distorted by malnutrition. A forensic reading of the ground and bone suggested not simply neglect, but human hands shaping death. That discovery fractured the legal argument almost immediately. You could debate whether breeding enslaved people was lawful. You could not argue that bones with perimortem trauma were not evidence of wrongdoing. The presence of human infants buried without name or ceremony, and the traces of violence in adult remains, reframed the story from clinical eccentricity to criminality. Margaret's certainty that ownership cleansed responsibility roared against this new testimony and lost coherence. Even then, the path to accountability was not straight. Witnesses like Hannah, one of the few who survived and who had been quietly terrified into silence, had no straightforward standing under the law of the place. Her voice, when she found the courage to speak, would still be treated as suspect by jurors whose sympathies lay elsewhere. But the combination of Augustus's map, Chen's persistent gathering of corroboration, Pembroke's late but devastating confession, and the graves unearthed in the pines created a pile of facts that a judge could not entirely ignore. The timing, however, proved beyond anyone's control. April of 1861 brought a thunder that made local scandals seem suddenly small. Confederate guns at Fort Sumter turned the country inward, and every courthouse, every clerk's ledger, every man of influence was called into the machinery of war. Sheriff Pritchard traded investigations for a uniform. The judge who might have moved the case forward left for military duty. Papers were shuffled into trunks and basements and eventually into flames in a dozen panicked places. Margaret was quick to grasp the opportunity. She burned what could be burned: journals, ledgers, anything that bore the bluntness of confession. She sold off portions of the property, dismantled the compound buildings in hurried, methodical fits of destruction, and moved herself to quiet her country across state lines. The sale of Belmont in June 1861 was clean on paper. The people who might have called it home were dispersed or buried, their stories left to the wind. The society that had once shielded her with polite applause now enabled her retreat through the disorder of war. Yet even triumph built on burning is brittle. Not everything could be consumed. In the chaos of haste and hubris, one ledger, one of the neatest, most clinical journals of the Purification Project, escaped the pyre. Hidden in a cavity within a foundation wall, it survived the decades like a held breath. It did not reappear until nearly a century later, when the state's appetite for roads cut through old land and men with heavy boots turned over soil that had not been disturbed in tractable time. 1959 was humid when the surveyors found the foundation. The highway crews pried open a sealed cavity and uncovered a leather-bound journal that smelled like old paper and secrets. Inside was the cold, elegant hand of Margaret's record-keeping. Measurements, bloodline charts, entries that mapped her logic of selection, and her clinical notes on births and deaths. It read like a ledger of intention, and reading it was to trace the arc of a plan whose cruelty had been administrative as much as it was violent. The journal's discovery forced a new, quieter justice. Historians and archivists verified dates and names. Skeletons recovered under the highway corridor confirmed that the ground had not forgotten what human hands had tried to hide. In the months after the find, professional excavations yielded more than the first handful of shallow graves. The bones of infants and adults, at least 61 individuals by the final toll, joined in a single, secret cemetery whose marks had rotted away long ago. The state moved with the slow, embarrassed diligence of institutions confronted with their own failures. The journal was placed under archival care. For a decade, access was restricted, while authorities weighed the ethics of exposure and the potential harm to descendants. When scholars were finally permitted to consult the pages in 1969, the academic response was sharp and unflinching. Papers followed that situated Belmont within a larger, darker history. How scientific language had been turned into an alibi for exploitation, how property law had been used to erase pain, and how the pursuit of improvement could degrade into a mechanized cruelty. Family memory, too, had its own timeline. Thomas had married in 1869, raised children, and built a life that, while forever marked by his early years, was also quietly ordinary in its later steadiness. His grandchildren, alive when the journal was finally made public, recognized the text as confirmation of stories passed down in fragments and with protective care. They chose privacy over public reckoning, an understandable protection in a society that still measured difference with old, hard eyes. They kept Thomas's truth inside the household, where it became a private sacrament rather than a public scandal. The bones recovered along the highway were reinterred in a single memorial plot, a stone now standing where once wooden stakes had rotted to nothing. The marker reads in simple, careful language, "In memory of those who suffered at Belmont Plantation, 1842 to 1860. May they rest in peace and never be forgotten." The names were not all known. Many graves remained anonymous, their lives and labors erased from ledger and census. The stone served as both acknowledgement and a kind of apology carved into the landscape. A modest formal attempt to give place to the people whom the ledger had reduced to notes. Yet artifacts and stone cannot fully restore what was taken. The journal's pages exposed the mechanisms of cruelty, the clinical voice that signed off on suffering, the charts that turned relations into variables, the language of purification used to justify the most intimate violations. Margaret Denore lived long enough to disappear into the confusion of the Confederacy's collapse. Some accounts place her in obscurity near Mobile. Others suggest she simply vanished from record. Pembroke, who had once lent his medical legitimacy to her designs and then repented, ended in ruin. Augustus lived his life with the weight of his confession settled like a stone in his chest. Hannah, the woman whose testimony, finally, had pierced a measure of legal armor, lived out a sparse life and chose a small grave under her own name. By the time the journal left archival secrecy, the country had shifted its vocabulary for discussing such things. Eugenics, ethics, medical abuse. but the raw terms of pain remained the same. The ledger had not been a singular aberration so much as an extreme articulation of an attitude that treated human bodies as resources. The revelation in 1959 reminded a new generation that the language of science can be used as a mask, and that legal authority will protect cruelty unless someone insists on the human face behind the file. There were still questions that would not settle. How many names had been lost forever amid burned pages and hasty graves? How many ledgers had been consigned to ash? And what, precisely, had been buried under the pines in years before the highway crews disturbed the soil? These are the seams left for historians to pry at, small, stubborn openings where memory clings to fact. But for Thomas and the few who survived to see the end of that experiment, the seizure of their narratives into paper and stone meant something steadier: acknowledgement. The ledger's existence made the silence brittle. The reburial made it formal. Yet the deeper unease lingered, the knowledge that a rational voice can be deployed to rationalize atrocity, that systems of law and ownership can mask profound moral failure. It is a lesson the country has repeated in different forms, and one that does not sit easily with the tidy stories we tell about progress. What follows is a quieter reckoning, the personal aftermath for those who survived, and the ways a single hidden ledger can change how a community remembers itself. But that is a different kind of history, an intimate, close reading of the lives that persisted after the ledger closed. Let us turn, then, to Thomas's later life, the small freedoms he found, and the private work of memory he carried to his grave, and to the families who chose silence over spectacle. The story of Belmont did not end with Margaret's disappearance, nor with the excavations that followed a century later. Its final shadows fell across the lives of those who survived, lives that continued quietly, almost anonymously, as if the world wished to smooth over the memory of what had happened in those pine-dark buildings. And yet the past is stubborn. It leaves impressions even when names fade, even when courts fail, even when the soil tries to fold its secrets inward. Thomas's life after Belmont began in a small Savannah home owned by Daniel and Abigail Hargrove, Quakers who believed that mercy was not charity, but duty. In the spring of 1860, when the compound shut and the law briefly stirred itself awake, they took him into their house. He arrived thin as a winter branch, pale and silent, carrying the residue of years spent as an object of study. He moved with careful stillness, unsure where harshness might erupt. The Hargroves treated him with a gentleness that at first seemed foreign to him, almost suspicious. But over months, something in him loosened. He learned to sit at a table without bracing. He learned the sound of footsteps that did not bring commands. He learned that not every locked door meant isolation. The Hargroves taught him to work with wood. His hands, once measured and catalogued, found steadiness in craft. Planes smoothing rough edges, chisels carving clean lines, the slow, honest merging of material and intent. Carving became a language he trusted more than speech. And as seasons passed, he built small things: stools, picture frames, simple boxes, objects with no purpose other than usefulness, created by a young man who had once been trained to understand himself only as function. The war erupted like a curse across the country, but within the Hargrove house, time moved quietly. News traveled through town, filling the air with rumor and dread. Thomas listened, but rarely asked questions. He had lived through one kind of violence his whole childhood. The nation's violence felt like a distant echo of something he already recognized. In 1863, The Emancipation Proclamation reached Georgia not in a sweep of triumph, but in uneven ripples. Legal freedom accompanied by practical uncertainty. For Thomas, emancipation arrived as a change of status more than circumstance. He stayed with the Hargroves because they welcomed him, not because law required it. A subtle but profound difference. By 1869, he had set aside the boyhood name his first owners had given him and took a new surname, chosen, not inherited, when he married Rebecca Williams. She was a free woman of quiet strength, raised in Savannah, whose laughter came softly but genuinely. Thomas rarely spoke of Belmont to her, but she understood enough from the shadows in his pauses. They built a life crafted from steady work and carefully tended comfort. They raised 3 children, none bearing the pale markers Margaret had treated as destiny. Each grew strong, dark-eyed, and free in a way Margaret's ledgers could never have predicted. Thomas watched them grow with a mixture of awe and fear, as if part of him expected some spectral hand from the past to reach forward and reclaim what life had given him. He lived to see grandchildren as well. In his later years, his hair remained near white, but his face softened. Neighbors described him as a quiet man who carried a sadness he did not voice, but who showed gentleness in small actions. Fixing a neighbor's door without being asked, whittling toys for children, planting flowers that thrived in Savannah's heat. He died in 1902 at age 56. His death was quiet, the kind marked by the tender grief of family rather than spectacle. He had once been called Subject Zero, a specimen in a ledger. He died as a husband, father, and craftsman, his humanity reclaimed by decades of quiet living. Robert Chen, whose moral clarity cracked open the secrecy around Belmont, carried the memory of the compound like a fever that never fully broke. Though he continued his medical work, the experience reshaped him. He abandoned inquiries into hereditary variation and instead focused on public health, pushing for care in communities long ignored. He wrote papers, not about Margaret or Belmont, but about the ethical obligations of physicians. Some of these writings circulated quietly through medical schools, but were never widely adopted. Chen himself remained a figure on the margins, respected by some, side-eyed by others who found his insistence on ethics impractical. In his private journals, preserved by a student after his death, he wrote about Thomas often, not by name, but as a symbol of what medicine must never become. His notes described the existential dangers of confusing observation with ownership, of letting scientific ambition overpower humane restraint. Chen died in 1892 at age 57, known to those around him as a man whose conscience was burdened but unbroken. Harrison Pembroke did not fare so well. Though his testimony had been the first from a white physician to indict Margaret's work with credible authority, he never forgave himself for the role he had played. His drinking worsened. He withdrew from colleagues and spent years oscillating between guilt and denial. By 1867, the strain overcame him. He died by his own hand, laudanum providing the quiet oblivion he had sought. His final note was brief and cryptic, almost a confession, almost a plea. Forgive me for the things I named as science. Augustus, the man who had driven Margaret's carriage for decades and who had seen more of Belmont's horror than anyone, lived into the late 1870s. Freedom complicated his life. Trauma shaped it. Those who knew him remembered a man who rarely smiled, who moved as if he were carrying something heavy inside him. He worked as a freight driver, traveling roads that passed near the land where Belmont once stood. When he died in 1879, he was buried under a simple stone. No inscription marked his courage, the courage of a man who chose truth over silence, knowing the danger of both. Hannah, who had survived the breeding protocols through submission and lived long enough to testify, carried her own quiet grief. She settled in Savannah after the war, working as a seamstress. She never married. People in her neighborhood said she kept to herself, but showed a particular tenderness toward children, as though protecting them from sorrows they could not fathom. She died in 1876. On her stone, the words she requested were carved with pinpoint simplicity. She survived what should have killed her. Years reshaped the land. Belmont's main house burned in 1883, its cause never determined. The compound's remains were swallowed by trees. Stories grew distorted or forgotten. Rumors persisted in the surrounding county. Strange sounds once heard in the pines, odd patterns of graves, the whispered memory of a large woman who had kept too many secrets. But memory without record is fragile. And so the land lay quiet, its history waiting under decades of pine needles and soil until the road builders came. In 1959, when the journal resurfaced, it reopened a history that many believed had been lost, some willfully, others through time's erosion. Scholars descended on the document, tracing its entries against census records, property ledgers, and court archives that had survived the Civil War's ruin. They noted something unsettling. Many official records from Margaret's 1860 case had been altered or removed long after the war, suggesting deliberate suppression. The plantation society that shielded its own had extended its influence well into Reconstruction, ensuring that Margaret's name faded rather than ignited scandal. Even with the journal, mainstream history hesitated. It was easier to categorize Belmont as an aberration than as a dark extension of widely accepted beliefs. Yet the journal persisted, preserved behind archival glass, testimony in ink to what human ambition and authority can justify when draped in the language of improvement. The highway continued over the land. Archaeologists recorded the compound's foundations before they were destroyed. The cemetery was exhumed, its remains moved to a proper resting place. 61 individuals, infants to elders, were reburied beneath a shared stone. Their names were mostly lost, their stories reconstructed only partially. But the new grave granted them something Belmont never had: recognition. To stand before that stone is to feel the weight of silence punctured at last. Not repaired, not redeemed, those words belong to gentler histories, but acknowledged. And acknowledgement, however belated, is a form of light. A dim, solemn light, but light nonetheless. We often expect horrors to end with justice, but justice rarely arrives cleanly. Margaret Denore fled into history's margins, her death unrecorded, her final years swallowed by anonymity. Whether that obscurity was punishment or escape is left to belief. What remains certain is that the people she harmed were not erased, not entirely. Their suffering was excavated, named, and placed in view so that forgetting became harder, so that the fragile thread of witness did not snap. Stories like this one disturb because they reveal not monsters, but systems. Systems shaped by law, fueled by power, and excused by the language of reason. Margaret was not an anomaly. She was a culmination. The ideas that shaped her actions were shared across plantations, across academic circles, across the country. Belmont was simply one place where those ideas grew unrestrained, where secrecy allowed impulse to become method. What do you make of her disappearance? Did Margaret escape judgment, or did judgment follow her into whatever lonely, unmarked end awaited her? Share your thoughts below. And if this story has compelled you, if you want more of these dark, buried histories, Be sure to subscribe to Nictus Chronicles. Tap the notification bell so these shadows find their way to you. And remember, some of the most unsettling horrors are the ones that really happened, hidden until the earth itself gives them back. We'll see you in the next story.